The European Union says they're looking at opening up to tourists once again, but not just anybody. To talk about this in more detail is Toronto Sun columnist and one of our regular contributors, Brian Lilley. Brian, they're looking for countries with high vaccination rates, so Canadians may not necessarily be welcome?
Yeah, maybe not. I mean, if you're from the US, if you're from the UK, if you're from Israel, or a whole host of small countries that are not named Canada, then you might be able to get into the European Union this year. Of course, everyone has been trying to tamp down on travel. It's not as if travel is completely banned, and we see that in our own country, but there have been attempts to try and make sure that you can't travel as much as you want because of COVID. Well, the EU says they want tourists back this year. They're hoping that their vaccination program is far enough along that they're doing okay, but they're open to countries that are even further along than the European Union is and saying, come on in. Now, this is going to cause a lot of consternation about something called vaccine passports, which some people are very hesitant about. Um, and I understand if it's a vaccine passport about whether you can go to the movies or whether you can go to a restaurant in your own town. But let me tell you, Hal, you better get used to the idea of a vaccine passport for international travel. They already exist for an awful lot of countries. If you want to go to a lot of places in Africa, if you want to go to a lot of places in Asia, South America, you need to be able to prove that you've had specific vaccinations for diseases that we may not have here. And you have to carry that with you the whole time. Anybody that's been to these countries has dealt with that. Well, now it's going to be for COVID-19 as well. If you haven't had your vaccine, they may say, you know what? We like you very much, but you're not welcome here.
Now, Brian, the United Kingdom has apparently hit her immunity between people who have been vaccinated and those who had COVID-19 and recovered. The U.S. is getting fairly close. Now, with the lower infection rates here and lower vaccination rates, what's really the prognosis here in our country?
Well, as we heard from Dr. Teresa Tam, the Chief Medical Officer of Health from Canada, for Canada, we might be able to see a loosening of some restrictions come summer if we get about 75% of the population with one dose and 20% with two doses. That's kind of her prognosis. We won't lose all restrictions by then, but we'll be able to start opening back up a bit more. That does not sound, overly optimistic as far as I'm concerned. But here's the thing. We are going to be paying the price potentially on two fronts. One, Canada was never as bad as much of the rest of the developed world when it came to the number of COVID infections. I know that, you may have paid attention to your local media and they made it sound like the sky was falling, but our infection rates were never as high as the US or the UK or even Israel. And these are all countries that did much better than us when it came to vaccinations. So we did better on the front end in terms of not having as many cases, but we're doing badly on the back end because we don't have as many vaccines to dole out. Well, both of those are going to come together and bite us in the butt, as it were, because we're not going to hit that herd immunity. Herd immunity is a combination of infections and vaccinations, and are people safe from this being it's not going to go away, but is it going to be a going concern that can overwhelm the healthcare system? That's going to be an issue for Canada longer than it is for countries that either had A, large-scale vaccinations, or B, large-scale infections. We've got neither. It's actually the worst of both worlds for getting out of this.
Now, each week we hear about how our country is receiving so many doses of the COVID-19 vaccine. This week, almost 2 million, but then provinces don't deliver that many doses in a week. Why is that?
That's because of how the vaccines are received and then delivered. So, if you remember back to February, Pfizer, seemed to be an awful vaccine partner because they cut us down to zero at one point. And then I think they had said, it'll be about 20 to 50% reduction in doses. Well, we went to zero, then we went to 20%, and other countries were getting more, and we're thinking these guys are horrible. They've since become the most reliable partner for Canada when it comes to delivering vaccines, and they tend to arrive on Monday and Tuesday of each week, and they are sent directly to where they're going to be used. So If they're going to be used where you are in Lethbridge, they're delivered to Lethbridge. If they're going to be used where I am in Toronto, they're delivered to Toronto. The other vaccines, we're talking Moderna, AstraZeneca, and now Johnson & Johnson, well, those are delivered to the federal government. The federal government has generally taken about 5 to 7 days to then turn around and parcel them out and send them off to the provinces. So we get this, we're going to get almost 2 million doses. Well, about half of that, about the 900,000 roughly, are the doses that the federal government gets. It takes them about a week to get them out to the provinces. So this week is actually very slim for the provinces. Let's put it that way. The numbers won't be as high regardless of which province you live in because they're pretty much dealing with Pfizer. Even if they get the Johnson & Johnson or the Moderna by Friday or Saturday, they've still then got to turn around and send it out to all the locations that will be used. So those doses will not be going into arms until sometime next week, and that's at the earliest. So next week is going to be very good. As of next week, we start getting 2 million doses a week of Pfizer. As I said, those go directly into the communities they're going to be used in. That's going to speed things up, get us closer to that normal type of life that we all want to get back to.
We've talked often about concerns that people have regarding low platelet counts and blood clots with the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But now, Brian, we're hearing reports about a 54-year-old woman from Quebec dying in connection with the COVID-19 vaccine. Many are wondering, should they even bother getting this vaccine?
Well, at this point, as we're talking now, we don't know if it was directly related to getting this vaccine. That's still up in the air. The Montreal University Health Network, which is the hospital that this happened in, has said that yes, the woman had received it. We don't know about her underlying conditions. I have not received the vaccine shot yet. I've tried, but I think that it's still less than 1 in a million, which is a better survival rate than COVID, but there is a risk. And I think that it's incumbent upon health professionals to explain that risk and go through the risk assessment with you. And if you've got certain conditions, maybe the vaccine's not for you. Quebec health officials still say that despite this risk, which is lower than, by the way, the risk of pregnancy, using the birth control pill, or just living day-to-day life for women, women are more prone to blood clots than men, that the risk is still lower and therefore still worth it. So health officials are still saying it's worth it. I think it's going, it should be up to you and your doctor talking it over, looking at your conditions. And if you have any conditions where blood clots, low platelet counts, any of those are a possibility, you should be discussing that with your doctor and maybe trying to wait until you get one of these other vaccines. As I said, 2 million doses of Pfizer showing up in the country next week.
Yeah, be well informed, absolutely, Brian. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole is telling the Liberals that we need to stop travel from some of the COVID hotspots and not just India and Pakistan. Now, Brian, a serious number of COVID positive people were still coming into Canada, pushing up our numbers.
Yeah, and we're talking about more than 3,000 cases over the last 2 months that tested positive on day one. That's numbers from the Public Health Agency of Canada that I received when I was writing on that this week. So that works out to about 2% of the passengers that they tested. Strangely, they're not testing all passengers upon arrival, and I'm still trying to get to the bottom of that. But 2% showing up is something that is of concern. The Chief Medical Officer of Health for Ontario, Dr. David Williams, and the Associate Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Barbara Yaffe, both tell me that they're concerned because Pearson is right at our door here in Toronto. It's just next door in Mississauga. It is the busiest international airport, and before we stopped the flights from India and Pakistan, that was 50% of all the tests that were showing up positive over the past couple of weeks. The United States is second to India. Pakistan, I'm not sure why they kept them in there. I think they just started to see an uptick in numbers and decided to include them both. But the United States is the second highest source of COVID positive flights coming into Canada. And some epidemiologists say the numbers could be even higher. So what's the answer? Do we shut down all flights? Do we shut down flights from hotspots? Some of the experts that I've talked to, Hal, say by the time you start shutting down flights from hotspots, it's too late. The variant's in the country. We saw that with the variant from India, the B1617. That's already in our country. Both Ontario and BC knew about it weeks ago. BC months ago didn't let the public know. The UK variant that showed up in December, that was in the country before we shut down flights. So we should be looking at better testing and better quarantine. Like I think I told you last week, there are people who are going into their homes to quarantine, and there will be 10, 12, 15 people in a house. There are stories in the Toronto media about students living like this. There are stories about multi-generational families living like this. And eventually, the whole house gets COVID. And suddenly you go from one person who came off a flight to a dozen or more contracting this virus. Somebody's going to end up in the hospital.
Brian, earlier this week, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said when allegations of sexual misconduct arose against former Chief of Defence Staff General Jonathan Vance in 2018, he didn't know much about it. Yet, as Aaron O'Toole pointed out, Trudeau's own staff used the term sexual harassment in emails. How could he have not known?
That really is becoming the question, Hal, because look, when we first found out the allegations against General Jonathan Vance, they seemed very slight and we didn't know much about them. And it's still shrouded in a bit of secrecy. But we're learning more and more by the day of an ongoing relationship with a subordinate officer that definitely would have violated the rules. We learned that when he was first appointed, the Conservatives heard vague allegations. In the Harper PMO tasked the National Security Advisor to investigate. They couldn't find anything and said, okay, well, we're going to go ahead, even though they'd quizzed Vance about it. 2018 comes around, allegations are forwarded on to the Privy Council office, they're sent to the Defense Minister's office. Inside Trudeau's own PMO, they're discussing using the word sexual harassment. And yet Trudeau says, we didn't know. He said in the House of Commons, we didn't know it was a Me Too type allegation. Well, his staff knew, senior advisors knew, to both him and to Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan. If you knew that someone was facing allegations of sexual harassment, would you extend their contract and give them a raise without first asking for an investigation? And that's at the heart of this. You know, in the end, I don't know where the allegations against General Jonathan Vance will go. But I will say that you should not be giving someone a contract extension and a raise when someone has come forward and said, there's allegations of sexual harassment. That should give you pause when you say you run a feminist government. That should give you pause to say, we need to look into this.
There is word that the federal government is looking to police the internet. Now, that is the claim over some changes proposed to internet regulations by the Trudeau Liberals. Brian, what do we know so far?
Well, you know, it's gone from talking about needing to make sure that hateful speech is not online to hurtful speech is not online. There's a world of difference between hateful and hurtful. And now we're talking about the government going in to regulate what you post as an individual user on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter or any of these other social media channels. There's talk of them, well, not just talk, they have voted and said that they want to do this in regulating apps. That content that goes against what is deemed appropriate needs to be taken down within 24 hours. If this was kept to what had previously been agreed to, you know, supporting terrorism, harming children, libelous actions, then I don't think there would be an awful lot of angst about this. But there are a lot of people on the left and the right who are now saying, wait a minute, you are going to be in charge? You, the government, is going to decide what I can and can't say? That is something that we should all be concerned about. That's not a partisan issue. You know, I doubt the Liberals would like the idea of, if the Conservatives were in power, them deciding what could be said online. If that's your view, then you shouldn't want your party to have the decision of what can and can't be said online. It is being described accurately as an attack on free speech, and the government needs to clean up not just their messaging, but their legislation and where they want to go on this.
You know, Brian, a lot of people would argue that a lot of our freedoms have already been taken away with the lockdowns and restrictions, so why not free speech as well, right? Toronto Sun columnist and political reporter Brian Lilley, thanks again for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.